2009, something quietly disappeared from America's roads. The last factory-built step-side pickup rolled off the assembly line, and almost no one noticed. For nearly a century, that distinct flare fender design defined what it meant to drive a truck. It was simple, iconic, and built to work. So how did the most recognizable truck style in history go from a symbol of American grit to a forgotten relic? This is the dramatic rise and fall of the step-side pickup. The birth of the step-side, function over form. In the early days of the automobile, trucks weren't about image. They were about survival. Farmers, builders, and factory workers needed machines that could carry anything, anywhere, and take a beating while doing it. The American pickup truck was born out of necessity, not design. Back in the 1920s and 1930s, what we now call the step-side wasn't even considered a design choice. It was the only way to build a pickup. Manufacturers placed the rear fenders outside the cargo box, creating that distinctive step and flared look, because it made the truck easier and cheaper to build. By keeping the bed flat and rectangular, companies could use fewer stamped steel panels, weld faster, and save money on materials. It wasn't about looking good, it was about working well. These early beds were practical. The side step made it easier to reach into the bed or load heavy equipment, and the narrow frame kept costs low. Every part had a purpose, even if that purpose was simply to make it to the next harvest. But as America began to modernize after World War II, the pickup truck started to change. No longer just a farm tool, it became something more. A symbol of independence, prosperity, and freedom on four wheels. And when that shift began, so did a new era of design competition that would eventually spell the beginning of the step-side's end, the 1950s, when style changed everything. By the mid-1950s, America was falling in love with the automobile. Highways were expanding, suburbs were booming, and pickup trucks were no longer just tools. They were becoming lifestyle statements. And for the first time, style began to matter. For decades, every truck looked nearly identical. Simple, squared-off beds with bulging fenders. Efficient, yes, but dull. Then came Chevrolet's bold experiment, the 1955 Chevrolet Cameo Carrier. Unlike the rugged workhorses before it, the Cameo was a luxury pickup. Sleek, smooth, and dripping in chrome. Its fiberglass fenders molded perfectly into the sides of the bed, creating the world's first fleet-side look. It wasn't built for farms, it was built for driveways, diners, and the open road. The Cameo's goal was simple: redefine what a truck could be. And while it didn't sell in huge numbers, it changed the industry forever. The message was clear. People didn't just want utility anymore, they wanted identity. Dodge quickly followed with the 1957 D100 Stepside, but their version was odd. Instead of redesigning the bed, Dodge literally bolted the rear quarter panels of a station wagon onto a truck chassis. The result was bizarre, complete with tail fins, but it proved that style was now a selling point, not just horsepower or payload. Then, in 1957, Ford took the idea and perfected it. The Ford Styleside debuted, the first truly integrated slab-sided bed that stretched the full width of the truck. It wasn't just beautiful, it was smarter. The new bed gave more usable cargo space, a flatter profile, and better aerodynamics. That innovation gave Ford a massive edge. Within 2 years, Chevrolet and Dodge scrambled to catch up, each introducing their own wide bed designs, the Fleetside and Swept line. By the end of the decade, every major truck maker was offering both, the old-fashioned step-side for traditionalists and the modern style side for everyone else. And in that single design split, the future of the American pickup was sealed. The 1960s, tradition fights back. The 1960s marked a crossroads for the American pickup truck. The sleek, wide-bodied Fleetsides and Stylesides were taking over showrooms, but the classic Stepside, with its narrow bed and exposed fenders, refused to die quietly. For many buyers, the Stepside represented something pure. It was rugged, honest, and unmistakably a truck. It didn't care about style or status. It cared about work. Farmers, contractors, and small-town drivers still loved that simple, boxy look because it stood for function over fashion. Automakers understood this nostalgia, but they also saw where the money was going. The new Fleetside trucks were easier to sell to suburban families, the ones who wanted a pickup that looked good parked next to a Buick. Still, to avoid alienating their loyal base, all three major brands, Ford, Chevy, and Dodge, kept producing Stepside variants. The Chevy C10 Stepside, the Ford F100 Flareside, and Dodge's Utility bed continued to appear in dealer catalogs. But even as they stayed on the order sheets, their designs began to look out of place. By the mid to late 60s, trucks were becoming more refined. Cab interiors were quieter, body lines smoother, and chrome trim more abundant. The utilitarian Stepside was starting to look like like a relic from another era. Designers tried to modernize it, giving it rounded fenders, new taillights, and more color options. But the truth was hard to ignore. These trucks were now afterthoughts. When engineers drew up new models, they designed for the fleet side first and then simply adapted a step-side version afterward. The body lines didn't always match. The proportions felt awkward. For the first time since the 1920s, the step-side wasn't the default. It was the option. And while enthusiasts still loved its charm, the sales numbers told a different story. The market was evolving fast, and the step-side was struggling to keep up. The 1970s, the last stand of the step-side. By the 1970s, the American truck was no longer a farm tool. It was a lifestyle symbol. Gas was cheap, chrome was king, and Detroit was in a horsepower war with itself. Yet in the middle of this evolution, one old-school design stubbornly clung to life. The step-side. Sales were dropping, but nostalgia was rising, and Dodge saw an opportunity. In 1978, Dodge introduced a truck that didn't just embrace the step-side look, it celebrated it. It was called the Dodge Lil Red Express, and it was unlike anything on the road. Bright red paint, wooden bed rails, polished exhaust stacks shooting skyward. This truck didn't hide its heritage, it flaunted it. Under the hood sat a high-performance 360 cubic inch V8, borrowed from the police interceptors of the time. In an era strangled by emissions rules, the Lil Red Express broke through every restriction. In fact, in 1978, it was the fastest American production vehicle from 0 to 100 miles per hour. Not the Corvette, not the Trans Am, a truck. It was loud, flashy, and proudly old-fashioned, and it worked. The Lil Red Express became a cultural icon overnight, reminding people that trucks could be both powerful and personal. Dodge even followed it with special editions like the Warlock, Midnight Express, and Macho Power Wagon, all using the step-side bed as a badge of identity. Meanwhile, Chevrolet and Ford still offered step-side options, but theirs had become quieter, nostalgia packages rather than flagships. Chevy's C10 step-side and Ford's Flareside were still available, but buyers were shifting toward the sleeker fleet-side styles that looked more modern and practical. The writing was on the wall. Even as the 1970s celebrated the past, the industry was looking forward. Fuel prices were rising, regulations were tightening, and aerodynamics was starting to matter. The curvy fenders and narrow beds of the step-side suddenly looked inefficient, a design born in a different world. The step-side had gone from functional to fashionable, and now to fragile. The 1980s, the slow fade. By the 1980s, the automotive landscape had changed completely. The fuel crises of the previous decade had reshaped how Americans thought about vehicles. Efficiency was in, excess was out. The market demanded practicality, comfort, and value, and that spelled trouble for the step-side. Trucks were evolving from rugged workhorses into everyday vehicles. Families were driving them to work, to school, to the grocery store. The average buyer wasn't a rancher anymore. They were suburban homeowners who wanted reliability, not personality. Manufacturers noticed the shift. To stay competitive, they streamlined production, designing, stamping, and assembling a second, narrower bed just for a niche group of nostalgic buyers didn't make much financial sense. Dodge was the first to bow out. By the mid-1980s, the Uline bed, their version of the step-side, quietly disappeared from catalogs. Ford and Chevrolet, however, kept theirs alive, hoping nostalgia could keep a flicker of interest burning. The Ford F-150 Flareside and the Chevy C10 step-side still had loyal fans. Farmers, restoration enthusiasts, and the occasional buyer who simply loved the classic silhouette. But even their designs betrayed the truth. The bodies of trucks were now designed for fleet-side proportions first, and the step-side variants were little more than stylistic add-ons. The curves no longer matched the rest of the truck. The lines were off. What was once a hallmark of craftsmanship now looked like an afterthought. And yet, that's exactly what gave the step-side its final bit of soul. It didn't follow trends, it resisted change. Even in its fading years, it remained a symbol of what pickups used to be: raw, mechanical, and unpretentious. But as the decade came to a close, so did the step-side's relevance. Trucks were getting bigger, rounder, and more aerodynamic. The once proud flare fenders now disrupted airflow instead of improving function. What began as a cost-saving design had become a liability. The step-side had survived wars, recessions, and generations of redesigns. But in the corporate-driven, efficiency-obsessed 1980s, sentimentality just wasn't enough to keep it alive. The 1990s, reinvention and a second wind. Just when it seemed like the step-side was gone for good, something strange happened. The 1990s brought a wave of nostalgia for retro designs, and suddenly old was cool again. car culture began romanticizing the past. Classic muscle cars were being restored, chrome trim made a comeback, and pickup trucks, once seen as purely practical, were becoming fashion statements once more. Ford and Chevrolet saw an opportunity. In 1992, Ford revived the Flareside for its 9th generation F-150. It was a nod to history. Now, the fenders bulged proudly again, the bed narrowed, and the name Flareside returned in chrome script along the tailgate. But this time, it wasn't marketed as a work truck. It was a lifestyle truck, a stylish option for people who wanted something different, something that stood out in a sea of boxy designs. Then came the spark that reignited real interest, the 1999 Ford SVT Lightning. Underneath, it was pure muscle, a supercharged 5.4-liter V8 pumping out 360 horsepower, capable of 0 to 60 in just over 5 seconds. But what made it iconic wasn't just its power, it was that bed. The Lightning's narrow, curved Flareside fit perfectly with its sculpted body lines, creating a cohesive, aggressive look. Suddenly, the Stepside didn't feel outdated, it felt purposeful again. Chevy followed suit with their Sportside Silverado models, rounded fenders, clean curves, and smoother lines that echoed the aerodynamic styling of the new millennium. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Stepside had found its rhythm again, but underneath the nostalgia and performance hype, reality hadn't changed. Fleet buyers still wanted maximum cargo capacity, contractors didn't care about styling, and as trucks grew larger and heavier, every inch of bed space mattered. The Stepside, with its curved fenders cutting into the usable area, remained a compromise, beautiful but inefficient. For enthusiasts, it was a collector's dream. For the market, it was a luxury that didn't make sense. The revival had bought the Stepside a few more years of life, but deep down, everyone in Detroit knew this was its last ride. The 2000s, the final disappearance. By the early 2000s, the pickup truck had evolved into something the original builders of the 1920s could never have imagined. They were bigger, heavier, quieter, and more refined. Luxury features that once belonged only to sedans, leather interiors, touchscreen controls, premium sound systems, were now standard in high-end trucks. And yet, amid all that progress, one relic of the past still lingered in showrooms: the Stepside. Chevrolet's Silverado Sportside and Ford's F-150 Flareside soldiered on into the new millennium, wearing their nostalgia like armor. They looked great in ads, they caught eyes on the road, and for a small group of buyers, they offered something the new slab-sided trucks couldn't: personality. But outside that niche, the world had moved on. Truck buyers wanted practicality. Every inch of bed space mattered for contractors, haulers, and families pulling campers. The wide, flat fleet-side design simply made more sense. The curved step-side fenders, once a clever cost-saving choice, now stole space and disrupted the sleek aerodynamics of modern truck bodies. Manufacturers were also facing new pressures. Emissions regulations were tightening. Fuel efficiency became a selling point. Aerodynamic drag suddenly mattered, and those protruding rear fenders weren't helping. What used to define a truck's toughness now made it less efficient and more expensive to build. By 2006, Chevrolet quietly discontinued the Sportside. 3 years later, in 2009, Ford ended production of the Flareside. And just like that, the Stepside's 70-year story came to a close. Not with a grand farewell, but with a silent fade from the assembly line.